Hello and welcome back to the From My Prospective podcast, where I, Jackson McCarty, tell you all the names you need to know in the college football landscape that could change the football landscape in the very near future. So today we get to do what we didn't get to do last week because of those previously mentioned technical issues. I brought those up on the last episode because we only had one episode last week, but we're back to the two, and we're back to 10 predictions spanning across college football for the upcoming week. If you're excited about these or if you're ready to get into them, make sure that you hit like and subscribe before we do it. Helps me out a ton. I'm just trying to grow the channel. So the first game I want to talk about here felt pretty comfortably like the biggest game in college football to me this week, and it is UCLA going up against USC. It's quite maybe not the same level that we thought it was going to be. A few weeks back, we thought this could be two one-loss teams really getting their chance to go at it and decide who's going to be the Pac-12 representative potentially in the college football playoffs. While if USC wins, that could still very much be the case, but I'm not going towards that. I think UCLA wins this one and takes the Pac-12 playoff hopes right off the map. The way I see it, USC doesn't have the defense or the big boys, talking about the offensive linemen there, to really compete with UCLA as far as setting the tone and as far as making sure to control the game. USC hasn't really shown me that they have that ability. UCLA, I would say that might be their primary thing that they have shown to this point in the season. You could argue that it's DTR's breakout year. You could argue Zach Charbonnet, but I don't think either one of those happen without that stabilizing factor that they do have within their roster. Caleb Williams for USC, he's an elite quarterback. He's going to be very hard to stop. They've got a lot of talent, talking about the Trojans, but UCLA is a better unit, all told, and I think we're going to see that in Pasadena. The big thing here is that no team within the Pac-12 will have a better record than 9-2 if my prediction holds up, meaning no one will have a real shot at the college football playoffs because in front of them you would still probably have Georgia. Tennessee would still be up there. Got the Rocky top shirt on today if you didn't catch it earlier. TCU's still in front of them, even with a one loss, I think. Obviously, whoever wins between Ohio State and Michigan, even the loser of that game, so long as it's a one-loss team, I think has got a good shot. But you see what I'm saying? Like, there's a long list in front of anybody, or in front of the Pac-12 teams that have 1 or 0 losses to this point in the season. It's been a really fun year for the Pac-12, do not get me wrong, but I do think that will end before the CFP begins. And then I'm not even going to make you come back to me because we got another Pac-12 game here. Oregon going up against Utah. I've got Oregon beating Utah, and it's going to set up what is truly an ugly finish to the end of the season. If you want an even more complicated situation, putting Oregon ahead of Utah, putting them out of contention for the Pac-12 championship after just losing last week makes everything so much more muddier because Utah to this point has shown that they have improved beyond that early loss to Florida to begin the year. And, they've really taken some big challenges along the way, namely that USC game, and ran with it. So, if anybody were to really have a super cool way to bounce back or at least get a really prominent New Year's Six Bowl, maybe not the playoffs, but something like that, I would say it's Utah at this point if USC loses. So an Oregon knocking them out makes it even more complicated. And, it's easy to say it because Oregon's still a really good football team. They just happened to lose to another really good football team last week with a legit Heisman candidate in Michael Penix Jr. The kid has been insane. He's been playing out of his mind. Utah did a great job of rallying back from some early struggles, but drawing Oregon at home and this close to the end of the year is such a roadblock, at least for me mentally, and one that I don't see them overcoming. I guess we'll have to see. That's back-to-back Pac-12 games, probably the two most important games in college football this week. And I think probably even feels a bit light and, kind of conservative because I really didn't see a whole lot on the schedule besides maybe one that we'll get to talk about later. But even then, I'm not just super into it as far as holding as much water as these two games do. Okay, so now we're going to move to the SEC. And last episode, I wore my Arkansas Dad t-shirt. I was proud of the Hogs for being able to keep it as close as they did against LSU and really providing a challenge for that game. I don't think it'll be that same beat this week because Arkansas has to play Ole Miss, who I do think will cover a 2.5-point spread. That is at the time of this recording. I think they'll cover that with some relative ease. I've got more of that 7 points to 10 points range for this contest. This is the week that Hogs fans will have to return to earth, because you can get excited that you hung in that close with LSU, but you've still got a lot of problems. Malik Hornsby's not it. KJ is prone to a lot of issues, and we saw it in the A&M game, namely, where he made that weird Superman dive and fumbled the ball and gave it up. He just doesn't quite, like, he doesn't rein it in properly whenever he needs to, so that could always present an issue for the Hogs. And the Rebels have just been a way more consistent team, way more reliable team all year, especially relative to Arkansas and LSU. I don't think that they'll blow the doors off of the Hogs by any means, but winning by that 7-10 range that I mentioned earlier feels pretty comfortable for me. Arkansas, they're 65th in rushing yards allowed per game. Ole Miss is a very clear path through that. I've talked about Kenshawn Judkins a lot. Zach Evans is really good. I'm impressed by him. They've got that clear path right there. And then when you look at the passing side of stuff, Jackson Dart has not been anything special, but he's throwing against the secondary that allows the 11th most air yards given up weekly. They have, I think it was 280 something yards. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was something pretty strong, and they're almost at the very bottom of college football as far as being able to stop quarterbacks. Again, I don't think Jackson Dart's really had the season that a lot of us maybe hoped for or expected, or what have you, but he should be able to take advantage of what that secondary gives him. It's an important road game for Ole Miss, but I do think that they handle it well. I think that this will be one that, when we look back on, it will be, well, that actually could have been a trap game as Ole Miss tries to close out their season as best they can. But I do think that Lane Kiffin's a smart enough guy and is very aware of that. Plus, they're coming off of that Alabama loss, which already seemed like a real crushing blow for them. So I think that they will bounce back and get right back on track. Another team that I don't think, they have kind of popped off the tracks a little bit is Illinois. They're still a really good team, don't get me wrong. I think that they're still one of the more impressive squads within the Big Ten. But this week they have to go up against who I would say is the most impressive team in the Big Ten, and that is the Michigan Wolverines. I don't think Illinois will really have just a super chance of winning this game, and I think it's going to prove as a really important game that Michigan walked away with right ahead of having to play Ohio State. Beating Illinois would be a very big result for the Wolverines, and that's not something that, if you would have played this clip to me when we started the season, I would have laughed, because I would have been like, what am I talking about? Just in pure shock. But man, that defense, it might be the most impressive that Michigan will have played this year. Maybe second to Penn State. I think that Penn State's team has been overlooked, especially considering, those losses to Ohio State and Michigan coming when they did. But, both teams are going to be very strong challenges, and we saw Michigan really have fortune rolling their way in that Penn State game. You might not really get to see that in the Illinois game, because they have even a problem on offense with Chase Brown, who's been an incredible running back so far this year. I would definitely take Sean Clifford over Tommy DeVito or whoever they're rolling out to start in Illinois at this point. But, you've got bits and pieces. I think Chase Brown is probably the most impactful player by himself that they've played this year, as a defense. So it could be an interesting game. I think that Illinois might present more problems than Penn State did, just purely on the fact that their defense has had way more time to be who it is. Penn State really kind of had an easy track through things up until that game with Michigan. Penn State, or Illinois rather, has taken their hits, and they've really worked to improve. This game being right before Michigan-Ohio State's game could be a really big problem too. It takes a lot to play Illinois, so that's not a good thing for Michigan, but it could provide very important battle scars. That's the big focus here. It could provide that extra little bit of grit, that extra little bit of tenacity to a team that's already proven to be very strong and, has gone through their tests of battles. Maybe not as many as a lot of people would prefer, but, it definitely sets the tone and shows this team what they're capable of dealing with. So when they have to play Ohio State, it really doesn't look like a whole lot in comparison, at least. Okay, so that's a little bit of the Big Ten talk that I want to do. Now we were going to go to the ACC. We're talking about Clemson, who has kind of disappointed a little bit, but I don't know that there's been any more disappointing team in college football for me personally than the Miami Hurricanes. It's been a really bad year to watch that team. They continuously lose to the teams that they shouldn't, get close to some teams that maybe they probably shouldn't be able to beat. It's a very strange year, but I do think that they're going to cover against Clemson. Granted, it does help me out that it's, a 19-point spread in favor of the Tigers, but I do think the Miami Hurricanes are going to be able to pull it off and, not win, but, start to show a little bit of hope and a little bit of potential for what we could see next year. Right now, they're 5-5. They're hitting 500 in conference games. I think both of those will drop below 500 at the end of this game. I am not predicting them to beat Clemson. I can't pretend like Clemson's been the strongest team this year, though. They lost to a big game against Notre Dame, and they lost by quite a bit. They have won 2 conference games by two touchdowns or more. One of those was a 15-point win over Louisville last week. The other one was opening against a very, very bad Georgia Tech. The rest of their games have been pretty close. It does scare me a little bit that Louisville lost to them by 15, and I would consider Louisville a much better football team than Miami right now. But, you can't do football math. That's never really a good idea. Clemson has not been definitive this year. So, Miami could at least luck their way into like a 13-point finish or somewhere in that general neighborhood and finish short of that 19 to cover. So, that's kind of one that I'm watching. I don't really have just a ton of actually football points on it. I just think looking at the way that these two teams operate, I think that you could start to see a little bit more of that talent, especially with it being such a big game. I could see a lot of the kids in Miami at the end of the year trying to make a big push to say, look, we deserve to be starters next year, because Mario Cristobal will have to start reviewing who he wants to keep in a prominent position next year. So, again, we're not going to even come back to me for video for this one. I've got Louisville, like we just mentioned them. They play NC State this week, and I think they continue their late season surge with a win over the Wolfpack. Since we just brought them up, let's go ahead and talk about them. They're 4-1 in their last 5, including wins over previously ranked Wake Forest and JMU. On the other side, NC State is 2-2 in their last 4. One of those wins was by 1 point against Virginia Tech. They're not having the greatest end of the year. I've talked about Devin Leary being out a number of times on this podcast. If you don't know already, he was very important to that team. They've scored 30 once in the last 5 weeks. The offense, not too awesome right now, and this is mostly a momentum prediction because Louisville, they have a lot of it. Whenever it comes down to it, momentum is the most valuable thing that you can factor in a lot of different games. Obviously, talent will trump at points in time, but the team that has the hot hand, a lot of the times has the very distinct upper hand whenever they play games, strictly because they're really they're feeling they're playing with a lot of chemistry, they're playing with a lot of vigor, and I think that holds true for the Cardinals for this upcoming week. We go to the Big 12 next, and I want to talk about a team. Speaking of being disappointing, we just mentioned it with Miami not too long ago, but the Oklahoma Sooners have been outright bad this year, man. They're still not bowl eligible, and we are 2 games away from the season ending. That's how dire this year has been for the Sooners. Oklahoma State's not been, incredible by any means either. That's who they draw this week, and I think that Oklahoma State pushes the Sooners one more week to not be bowl eligible. Man, it's been a bad year in Norman, Oklahoma. I mean, they're still not bowl eligible. You got 2 games earlier that you've got remaining to get to those 6 wins. And I would argue that this week is more winnable than Texas Tech will be, because Texas Tech is always a problem. I don't care what their record is. They're always difficult to beat. I'm breaking a rule that I made for myself here, because earlier in the year I said I was done predicting Oklahoma State games. I said that I was tired of it, that I just couldn't really buy into it anymore. I do have to break that right now, because if there's any team that's been more disappointing within the Big 12 this year, it is Oklahoma. So I at least take a little bit of comfort in that alone. I feel like the size and the meaning of this game is going to be enough to rally the Cowboys over OU and potentially destroy their hopes to go bowling. Because like I said, you can't overlook Texas A&M. That's not a game that is ever going to be easy for anyone unless you were just leaps and bounds better of a program. And I'm talking like Georgia and Ohio State and Michigan and things of that nature. Because if you're not definitively way above the pack, not only just at Texas Tech, but above the rest of college football, that team is going to be a difficult one to put away for you. on just about any week that you see them on the football field. So, and speaking of a team that would have a pretty easy go of things if they had to play Texas Tech, is Georgia, who takes on Kentucky this week, a game that I think a lot of us thought would be much larger at this point in the year than it actually will be. So I think that this game is, I don't want to do numbers really for this, but I do think that a really definitive Georgia win pokes maybe the final hole in Kentucky's year to this point, because when you sit back and look at everything that has happened to them this year, it has not been a good football team. It has not been a good season. It's overall been a very large problem for the Wildcats. We know Georgia's better than Kentucky, but this isn't really about that. If Georgia just truly demoralizes the Wildcats, Kentucky's season will have really completed a drastic nosedive. I mean, they lose to Vandy last week. They barely beat Missouri the week prior, and then they lost to South Carolina the week before that. It's been a really rough stretch for the Wildcats, and you can't expect to break that against Georgia, but having a performance that shows a little bit of hope and promise could help that. I just don't know that this Georgia team's the one you want to be playing right now to show some hope. They seem leaps and bounds better than you and just about anyone else in this country. So one last brutal showing to close out their SEC games, and then a potential loss to Louisville next week, because that's who they draw, and I'm sure that'll be a game that we get to talk about. That would leave them at 500 at the end of the year and 3-5 in the SEC, after being a team that people really liked. I believe they were, 7th in the AP poll at their highest? And I didn't bother to check that number, but that's what I'm trying. I think I remember that whenever they were up there and Arkansas was up there, and whenever, at the very beginning of the season, whenever everybody is inflated. But to go from that to not even positive within your conference, and and not positive really either, because you're sitting at 500 in the season as a whole, very bad luck. Very, very, very bad luck. My guess, if we need to put a number on it, I'll just take Georgia to cover. I want to say it was like 22 or something, but that'll be, if you need some kind of thing. Well, I guess I'll need it, because whenever I put up the graphic, I need to have a solid line that I can kind of cut from and be like, I was right or I was wrong. I've got myself into some tricky situations with my predictions before on that, but I think that I guess Georgia to cover would be my quantifiable portion for that. Okay, so that brings us down to 2 more games that I want to talk about before we go. And this next one's actually for a traveling trophy. I'm talking about Minnesota, and I'm talking about Iowa for what will be, in my prediction here, the first time that Minnesota has won this game in quite some time, because everything is starting to stack up really well for the Gophers headed into this game. This could be a really big week for not only PJ's flex team, but the coach himself. For one, their offense has been pretty good following that Penn State game. They're on a 3-game winning streak. We know that Iowa's offense is deeply flawed, and by that I mean hardly functional. And here's the fun part. Iowa, they've won the last 7 meetings of this game. 2 of those have been by wins, or been through wins by more than 1 score. So that tells you how close this game typically is for Floyd of Rosedale. And by the way, if you haven't seen this trophy, because I personally was not terribly familiar with it until a couple of seasons ago, go Google it, because it is really a cool trophy to just see and behold. It's usually a fun game here, and I really do like Minnesota's chance to flip the script, because you've got a lot of that momentum. You've seen me kind of go in favor of momentum a lot during this episode, but pay attention to Fleck's name and job searches if he completes this thing, because I don't know that he's going to be the front runner for very many jobs, but he's definitely going to start being somebody that'll get attention, and real attention, like from Nebraska. I don't know that Auburn will call him, but schools like that he could legitimately be a guy that takes over a pretty big program. And I think that he's had back-to-back seasons where he's done really good. He's really starting to build that stock, and I think he should really become a name to know off the back of this. And for our final one, not even going to come back to me for the video, because I don't want to spend just a ton of time on this, but TCU crushing Baylor. That line's at 2.5. If you don't know, the crush, we do that every single week. It has to be a line within 10. I have to project it to be a game separated by 17 or more. I've got TCU winning by 17 or more to Baylor. This spot has just been a curse all year. It's been a really bad situation for the people I put in this. I think I've won like one or two of these all season. But and I'm sorry for TCU if that holds true, but luckily for both of them, they've been trend breakers this year. Both of them being me and TCU. TCU's just been really good at separating themselves from what the rest of the world is doing and just going by the beat of their own drum. So maybe they'll help me here and break this funk that I've been in with this spot. TCU's been great. Baylor got embarrassed last week. They struggle with far worse teams than TCU this year. It's overall just a bad run of things, and I just don't really see Baylor's offense being anywhere near capable enough to hang in with the Horned Frogs. So what do you think of these predictions? You got anything you change? You got any that you want to add? Any questions? Make sure to let me know in the comments, or I'll leave the links to my Twitter, as well as a podcast that I do on MMA with my friend Alex Eisman that I work with. I'll leave that in the comment section down below too, in case you're interested in checking that out. But for now, that is episode 49, almost to 50, of the From My Perspective podcast. And as always, I'll see you next time.